Welcome to the second season of Woods in the Sound, dedicated to cultures of forests.
Forests invite us to reimagine and live into other ways of knowing and being, of conceiving of the self and community. From forests we learn to see the world as complex, interconnected interactions of multi-species agents and their mutual becoming. Forests offer an imaginary where within all kinds of relationships, attentiveness and connectedness replace fragmentation and exploitation, leading towards a more symbiotic togetherness. In these upcoming episodes, we are exploring the subject of forest gardens, otherwise known as food forests or regenerative agroforestry, as a framework some people find towards regeneration of monocultural landscapes and healing of agricultural deserts, with an intention to grow food, and not only, in more meaningful ways, while taking care of biodiversity, soil life, and other reciprocal relations.
Please note, this research takes us around Europe, and sometimes we record these conversations in the original language of our guest, or host, thus also experimenting with multilinguality. In the podcast notes you can find the link to a video of the episode with subtitles in English. It might anyway be useful to visit the video version if you want to see the person and the land we are conversing with.
In this episode we are visiting Wouter van Eck, a co-creator of the food forest Ketelbroek and one of the visionary pioneers of the food forest movement in the Netherlands.
Very nutty.
In our country we have those empty spaces, we call this agriculture, but it's limiting the photosynthesis amount of which is maybe not that clever. We have monoculture, we have I worked for Friends of the Earth Netherlands as head of the campaign on food and agriculture issues, so fighting factory farming, fighting use of pesticides, lobbying for improvements in policy, supporting organic agriculture, but even organic agriculture in our area, which I'm in favor of, is not that nature rich, and it's also not using trees and shrubs that much. I still consider me not being very old, but I know species disappeared from the countryside, which are not there in spring anymore. You might know the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It's from beginning of the 60s, but she predicted what happened in the Dutch landscape. It's getting silent in spring, and some birds are not there anymore. Or used to be there with hundreds of thousands, and this is even happening every generation, every 20 years. 50 to 70% of insects and birds is disappearing and not replaced by others. It's really, but you can see it at our green meadows. They are too green. There are no dandelions flowering anymore, no cuckoo flowers flowering anymore, no daisies. They were there, and then you attract and give place to live to insects and for birds. But it's gone due to monoculture and pesticides. And then we do have nature reserves, but nature reserves more or less are for humans ornamental. So we lock up nature in those reserves, and it has no other value for us anymore. So we separate agriculture, food production and nature. And by the way, the nature reserves are too small to survive all those vulnerable species. So the total amount is going down. There is a Dutch journalist coined this feeling. The landscape is still green, but it gives me sadness because the species disappear. Landscape sorrow. One was a good experience I had being a student some times ago, maybe. I was in Eastern Africa. I had to monitor development projects initiated by Dutch government on what they called improvement of Kenyan agriculture. So, and this was just the recipe being normal in our country. So you have to have more external inputs, artificial fertilizer, pesticides, and monocultural cropping system. And the crop, well, it's originating from Mexico, but it was corn. And but I noticed, just with own eyes being there, you can have with those recipes called Green Revolution, you can have a high volume of that crop on your area. But the traditional farmers were growing a mixed system with they also did grow corn, but mixed it, for instance, quite often with lentils, which is already better for your diet because you have a pulse and a grain, and together it's all proteins we need. But for the soil, the root structure of maize is very simple, and if you have this in a monoculture field on a slope and there's a tropical rain, you have erosion. And the lentils have a very fine root structure and avoid erosion soil erosion to occur that easily. But they also fix nitrogen from the air with the bacterium like most pulses do, leguminosa, and feed the corn, which is not able to do so. So they did not need external fertilization, but it was produced on the fields. And so I was a bit critical about those Dutch agricultural engineers from Wageningen doing the copying system from here to there, and even knowing, well, if the summer of the growing season is not that stable, which can occur in that area, if it's a long dry period, you can invest in hybrid seeds and add fertilizer and grow monoculture crop, but it will not grow. It's too dry. And if there are heavy rains, which is possible, you get erosion. So it was very insecure. And then the farmers, small farmers, get indebted because they had to pay for fertilizer and hybrid seeds, the external inputs. I was a bit critical. I was maybe not diplomatic, so it was quarreling a bit, only words, with those engineers. And then one said, but what do you want over there? And he was pointing at the slope across the valley. You cannot call that agriculture. It was a strange remark. And we were not, since we were not at peace with each other, I just walked over there to check the other side of the valley. It was a lush forest with many trees and shrubs. Also people were living there, and you can see the smoke. They used wood for fire to cook meals. And when I was there, the soil was smelling and having the moisture like in a natural forest, and it was noisy with all insects and birds around. But it was also like an almost edible paradise because there were huge mango trees, and I still refuse to eat mango here because the fresh ones from growing at the spot, they are the very best. There were huge avocado trees, which is at that time was not yet popular in Europe and the United States, but we know about the good nutritional value. Now, there were papaya and banana, and those were, they are understory in the canopy understory. There was tea and coffee, which the people themselves do not consume, but that's what they sold to have income to pay the uniform for the kids. It used to be a British colony, so at school the kids need uniform. It's one of the biggest expenses some people have, etc. And I'm a bit a plant nerd, so I very easily recognize plants and store knowledge about plants and don't forget that easily. So I knew about some of those crops, that this was not a natural forest, it was functioning as a natural forest. And even the mango is from India and Bangladesh, so it's from Asia, and the avocado is from Mexico, and they were there together in Africa. So the farmers adjusted a forest system to produce, to give harvest for them as well, apart from all the birds and insects which were living there as well. And then I started to think, how would this be in our own country? We cannot plant these species, they die at winter, but we must search for species that can come from elsewhere, like in Kenya, and together build like a natural forest. There was an idea I got over there. Even when we started our own food forests, we like to plant as much different edible species as possible, because we were curious, and it's happiness to see them all grow and to taste them. But this makes a beautiful scenery, and this almost very close to romantic landscaping, because you also have to have the plants at the right spots. You have to respect the ecological conditions for them to grow. But that's not very practical if you want to scale up production. If you want agriculture to make a shift into sequestering carbon, restoring water management, bringing back biodiversity, and adapting to food forest principles, it's just too chaotic, too little harvest at one moment at certain spots. So therefore we came up with what we even sometimes called a compromise with ourselves. We have to still respect what the ecological principles of a natural forest are, which you mimic in the food forest system, but you simplify partly by planting different species, certain species in rows. And then you can have 80 meters of almonds, 80 meters of black gooseberries, 80 meters of quinces. So then you can more easily harvest, maybe even in the future with robotica, if labor in Europe stays to be very expensive and limited. And that's a way forward to develop bigger agricultural areas which now cause ecological damage, and there is no future for them to feed the world, since they're depending upon fossil fuels and they are not climate proof, and the food forest system is not depending upon fossil fuels. So this is the Schijndel project, the 16 hectare plot. It used to be just one bare field to grow your annual crop, being maize, corn, next to nature reserve. But for this one, the province of Brabant, the owner of the area, asked our foundation to lease it. So we actually pay for this project. We are paying a rent every year, also 20 years, and we came up with a design. First is bringing back hedgerows, which are often in the old agricultural landscape, smaller plots, and the hedgerows are of course very nice for biodiversity. You plant many indigenous shrubs, hawthorn, black sloe, elder, holunder. They're nice for insects, nice for birds, but they also give shelter against the wind. So for the in-between area, it's more sheltered, less exposure, less dehydration. And also for the designing of the total, this is quite huge area, and now we have roughly 15 plots on average an hectare. And this is for the designing more easy, and then you continue having the design. And here you see the polyculture image with on average per plot 16 woody species, but they differ with each plot. So the total is still very, very abundant amount of different producing species, but it's 80 meters of black gooseberry or white walnut or almond or fig. And you can even, the designing principle, so the south is down there, so you make an edge for those sun-loving species, but they have a balcony to the south, and then shade for those who dislike overexposure to sun. And then you can repeat 2-3 times in one area. And down here in the southern part, close to the village, this is a romantic food forest with a pond, a picnic place, even more species per hectare, a lot to taste, many different species blossoming. School kids can come for education, etc. And this is the production food forest system. Species in nature are often cooperating and needing each other. So they are a community. And we, in our cropping systems, we introduce plants from elsewhere, often from far away. The potato is for kartoffelsalad is coming from Peru, and the cucumbers, the gurken, are from India, but we cultivate them in fields and often in big areas, and then we have to spray pesticides. But if you think about, hey, how to create a system with different plants and other species cooperating, we can introduce species because they are for us very useful and giving us good food, but they should be part of a system. And also because we need insects, bumblebees or hoverflies and nocturnal butterflies to do the pollination, then there should also be there enough pollen and nectar for them when our crops are not flowering. So we also need species early flowering for them. And actually this is how nature organizes itself. If you look at more or less natural systems, this diversity is there. And by designing or planting food forests, take this in consideration and do this with almost the eyes or the nose of the insects, because they cannot live for 12 days of flowering of apples only, and we have no apples without them. So this is also a society of species together in a forest system. Is growing a soil food web with many and even per square meter it's thousands and maybe 100,000 of different organisms. But a key role is for the fungi, and in 1 teaspoon of forest floor earth it can be easy 150 meters of fungi. We see nothing, but you have to look very precise, and this is in the system. But they are needed, and some of them decompose organic materials and make them available, which is a good role. But some of them are making symbiosis, alliances with trees and shrubs, and they get out of the photosynthesis from the green leaves energy easy accessible, but they have to give something back. It's kind of it's love and trade at the same moment. They have to give micronutrients, which the roots of the trees cannot find themselves, but the fungi can. And therefore, a forest, after 1 year of grow, without external fertilization, the floor is more rich, more fertile. And this is a beautiful process, and actually saying to us, we are not needed to increase fertility, to increase biomass, to increase carbon stored in the soil. Nature is doing this for us. If we let nature do it. Well, looking at ecological processes, nature wants to grow a forest, always, everywhere. So that's the food forest over there. When we started in 2009, this square area looked the same as the area over there. I briefly explained that we adjusted the area back in 2012 because this area tends to be a bit wet. There are hills around, but if the water table in soil becomes very high in winter, when there's a lot of rain, like today, it's little rooting space for the taproot species. For instance, interesting species like sweet chestnut and kaki and pecan and black walnut, they need to go deep with their roots and still have oxygen in the soil. If the water table is very, very high, you cannot grow them. And we did one trick. Our flat area, flat field, we partly created wetland nature by digging deeper. Wetland nature is nice because it's the home of many species which are useful. For instance, frogs and toads, amphibians need wetland nature, but toads also eat insects and balance species richness. But by digging for wetland nature, you can also elevate other parts, and then you have some drainage and more oxygen in the soil for those taproot species like sweet chestnut, kaki, pecan. You plant them on the elevated area. This is a designing principle you can do at the beginning of your project because you make a lot of disturbance. You do everything which is bad for soil life, with UV light and oxidizing of organic matter, but then you adjust and keep it in peace for the coming 400 or 500 years. For Dutch circumstances, this is a very special view because you see this stream is partly becoming the home of a beaver family. They chop down trees, pioneer species which did grow spontaneously on the banks of this small stream. They made a small dam, they chop, they eat from the twigs and as part of the bark with the cambium containing sugar. That became their home. But the beavers got extinct in the Netherlands in the 19th century. They were not there anymore. They were reintroduced during the 90s. It's only 30 years ago. But now the population is increasing. And when we started this project, they were not yet in this area, but they came swimming 3 years ago, and the other fields had nothing for them. They made a dam, built a lodge. We will pass it soon. And this was for us a bit special and a bit strange because we were enthusiastic about this beautiful creature taking a role in the landscape again and even helping to store water in very dry and hot summers we had the previous years. But since they are very good in chopping down trees, it's also making us a bit nervous being food forest farmers depending upon trees. But we are, at least until now, we live very well together with the beavers, since they chop on the banks of the streams. And in our design of the total food forest, we said the banks are for nature. And our species which offer us harvest, some of them in the future, are a bit farther away. And they do not chop down trees further away. So this is also how we can learn again to live together in the same landscape with those other mammals. For them, they take care of the streams and the banks, and we harvest a bit further away. This is the lodge of the beavers. They elevated water table here by building that dam, and the entrance of their lodge is under water table. So they make a big hole in this bank of the stream, but I need to breathe, so there's a kind of chimney for ventilation, and then the wood is putting on top of that ventilation area to keep out predators. Especially, they probably have 1 or 2 babies right now, and they have to protect against weasels and others to enter. So they even bring up mud to, and actually this is what they are doing is very much how the Dutch people used to live 3,000-4,000 years ago, but they were learning from the beavers how to build dikes, dams, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and then they were not cooperating with the beavers but made them extinct. You can see here the running off of water. This is soil erosion in action. The water is not infiltrating, but running off the field, taking soil particles, making this more muddy. And if you look at the 2 colors here, you can see the water passing the food forest is less muddy because there's not that much soil erosion going on. When we started the project in 2009, this was totally flat, bare area with a lot of wind. The first thing we did was planting that row of black alders, Almus glutinosa. They like wet conditions, so they are happy today. They grow fast, they are pioneer species. They like sunlight, they need it, and they can stand wind well. The southwest is over there, so they are blocking the wind and giving shelter to the other species we planted. And also for us it's more nice to have less exposure to the wind. But also for these species we planted here on the slightly elevated area. So you can see this is the original field level and then it's going a bit up. So therefore there's more rooting space for the species over there. The one flowering now is Pyrus xingxianensis from the northwestern part of China, close to Tajikistan, Kazakhstan bordering countries. They're delicious fruits. They're not Pyrus communis. It's really another species, but same genus as pears. And then there's a row with almost flowering ones. This is Pyrus pirifolia, the nashi pear from eastern part of China, Korea, Japan. They have many varieties, like we in Europe have with apples. They are not native. The apples that originate from Kazakhstan. This is the more in the center of the Silk Road, and the species more to the east did not make it to Europe back during when the Greeks and the Chinese had those exchanges. So they came more recently, but they originate from areas where the winters can be as cold as they are sometimes in our country. So therefore they grow well and produce well here. Sometimes the badgers come, even if when there is fruit lying down there, they can eat it. And we use the same paths. And that's nice. Also you can see a lot of plants growing. Some people tend to call these plants weeds. I call them volunteers. because they arrive by themselves, they do photosynthesis, they improve the soil, they make organic matter, they sequester carbon, they give food for many useful insects. And people tend, when they have an orchard, tend to mow below. But the trees never ask for that. It's a cultural thing to have things like sauber and clean. But it's not clean if you fight nature. It's making emptiness. And for the trees, it's less good soil life, less fertile soil. So if you, sometimes I can hear people say when they pass the road, over there it's an abundant orchard, and that's a compliment. We are much less needed than we think. And actually, this is stinging nettle, and this is a spring vegetable. It's very nutritious and early in season, so we do harvest. But there is still plenty of them. We cannot harvest everything. But also, you can see those leaves have holes because insects eat from it as well. And when you let these grow, there are around 200 different insects in our country, species, eating from stinging nettles. Some of them need stinging nettles, certain butterflies. Some of them prefer stinging nettles. If you would have mowed or sprayed them, then those insects would have to go to the autumn olive, the chestnut, the kaki, the apple. But now they prefer to eat from stinging nettle. And that's fine, we have plenty. This part of the food forest looks very chaotic, but it's organized chaos. So plants have their preferences and we should respect them to let them grow well. For instance, this is a picnic place, so it's open space. And to the north, it's a site over there, we grow the sea buckthorn. And the sea buckthorn is sun addicted. It dies in shade, even in its own shade. So the lower branches die back. But since the sun is in the south, this is open space. They're feeling well here and growing well, and you can harvest. But over there you see higher trees casting a shade, and that's the space for other species who dislike sun or exposure to sun for many hours a day. For instance, the bladdernut species, which has edible leaves and shoots coming weeks, it cannot stand sunshine the whole day, and that can be planted over there. The ones in front, white willow, grey elder, birch, poplar, we planted, and it's almost 50 years ago, and they're almost 15 meters high. And yeah, this is giving hope. The empty landscapes, the deserts of Dutch agricultural can become a forest, can become a productive forest, can sequester carbon, can stand the coming heat waves, like this system did stand the heat waves of last year and the years before, which were damaging the agricultural fields around us. Well, we hear the rain dripping down, but if you listen carefully, you also can hear birds, which you cannot hear in the surrounding agricultural system. So, and there's research done on biodiversity in our area, even compared with a nearby nature reserve, being Natura 2000, so highly protected and vulnerable nature, but the amount and species richness of nesting birds is about the same level. And even with nocturnal butterflies, the species richness is about the same level, and the amount of individuals higher in the food forest system. But I think this has to do with partly the diversity, so you have pollen early in the system, in the year, and later during spring and summer even, and it's building up fertility by accumulating biomass. And the layering of the food forest system and in fertility of the soil. So there is each year more to eat, and even the amount of birds is increasing every year, but their predators too. So weasel, fox, hawk, sparrow, all are here to be seen also. And for the total, this is fine. You don't have the predator if the other population is not healthy and big enough. There are also different areas. Like here is the sunny spot with the picnic place and the place for the sea buckthorns, sun addicting, a small pond. But then there is an edge with species liking both a bit shelter and a bit sunlight. And there is what we call the deep and dark forest, where the highest trees are growing, and in the future the canopy will be sweet chestnut and linden and Korean pine and pecan. Now it's built into a forest system by willow and poplar, being the first ones to grow big. But underneath are growing other species which are shade-loving. They cannot grow here in the normally sunny spots. And so I invite you for an expedition to the deep and dark forest. Now here you see raspberries. These are the last year that's called in Dutch herfstframboos, autumn raspberry. But then if you don't cut them back, they will also give you a harvest in beginning of summer. So it's two harvests, one in autumn, one in summer. Then there is over there a tree called Tuna sinensis with edible leaves, tasting like French onion soup. And there's a climber in it, the hardy kiwi, for edible kiwi berries without hairy skin, so you can eat them like grapes. And here you can see the growing of the layers, because in this square meter you can harvest leaves of the French onion soup tree, you can pick kiwi berries and harvest raspberries. One of the problems of climate change is that it's getting hotter and drier, but it sometimes can be very unstable in winter. So the lowest temperature sometimes will be very low still. So we cannot plant mango or avocado. And this will not be possible in our area. But planting species from continental origin, we are normally, they say this is temperate climate close to the sea, so you don't have very cold winters and not very hot summers, and this is not true anymore. We already went 2 times above 40 degrees, which was never before in the 20th century. So that is, you need to have species which can survive such circumstances. But sometimes you really will have -20 or -25 still. Not every winter, but sometimes. If in the beginning of January, it's because even the weather above the North Pole is unstable. Like in Northern America, last winter they had very, very cold temperatures, and this can happen to Western Europe as well, every now and then. So -25 must be possible to survive for species also. The good thing is, apart from climate crisis not being good at all, species from continental climates are more used to hot winters, hot summers with very high temperatures and very cold winters. Like the walnuts themselves, they come from Western Asia in origin, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and they have cold winters and hot summers. Like the kiwi species, when they are in winter, they can stand -25 without any problem. But they also can stand hot temperatures. So those are the most useful species when you think about what future temperatures will be. And the other thing is the food forest system is creating microclimates. With less wind, there is less evaporation, so less drying out. It's storing water in soil with soil organic matter and infiltration. With the cooperation between fungi and trees, the fungi will deliver water in very dry periods. So with the dry summers we already had and the heat waves longer as ever before, it stayed a green and pleasant place, which was kind of stress test very early, because this still is a young forest and forest age of way of thinking, but it's survived, and production even increases during those hot and dry summers, since when you start a food forest, don't expect a harvest the next year, and even not the first 5 years, because well some apples and berries there will be, and then the birds steal them because they are hungry and thirsty in our landscapes. But then production increases, like the figures we know from a certain pandemic. It's going like exponential growth, and this is happening after maybe 10 years. We are in the midst of this growth now, and even it was that hot and dry, the growth continued, and the harvests were more than the years before. And this is giving hope for the future.
Thanks for tuning into Woods and the Sound. In the notes, you will find all the links and credits for audio and video context markers of this episode. See you in the woods.